Yesterday we read together an article called Hellfire, which dealt with how the Puritans approached dissidents, or those that were in disagreement with them. For today, you were to have read a selection from a chapter entitled Pruning the Vineyard, which gave a little bit different perspective. So, yesterday you thought the Puritans were pretty nasty people and how they treated dissidents. Did anybody change their minds concerning the Puritans? Really? No one did? So, yesterday you were pointing out that they never gave her a chance, they didn't try to talk to her, and yet in the article you read, or the chapter you read for today, it talks about how they went to her again and again and tried to get her to change and gave her every opportunity to stop what she was doing. And so you still think the Puritans were nasty, horrible people. Okay, apparently you did not read carefully the chapter that you were supposed to have read for today. You should not have had that impression from that. So the lesson here is you need to read more carefully because the chapter you read had exactly the opposite viewpoint. The article we read in class was written by someone who is very much anti-Puritan, anti-Christian. Came out of a magazine that's put out for public schools. Christian schools could get it too, I suppose, but it's a secular magazine, and so that perspective was very tainted. The chapter you read was more factual, more based on what actually happened. And you should have discovered that the Puritans, although they did not want there to be disagreements, did not treat her as was indicated in the first article. So if you didn't get that, maybe you should look back over that article, that chapter again. The lesson was supposed to be that you need to check your sources whenever you read something. Never accept the perspective of a particular author without checking to see whether there are others or not. But for you, the lesson apparently needs to be you need to read more carefully. So be discerning either way. Stephen?
Did they ever actually persecute people? Or?
Yeah, yes, after warnings that people would not conform to the standards of the colony.
Okay, I was just wondering if it was still considered persecution or not.
Well, I guess you could use that word. Certainly those that were on the receiving end would have maybe thought so. But remember, they are seeking to establish what was called a city on a hill. They're seeking to establish a colony which is God-centered. Now, keeping in mind that they understood that if there was sin, if there was rebellion against God within the community, that God would not only judge that person, but judge the whole community. They wanted to avoid that. They wanted to avoid the sin of Achan. Do you remember Achan? Achan, the people of Israel were told before the Battle of Jericho that they were not to take anything for themselves. They were to destroy it all. What did Achan do? He took not just one thing. He took some clothing. He took, I think, some gold, something like that, and he hid it. Well, they went out to the next battle. What happened? Israel fought against Ai. Yeah, they lost him, and many of them died. How many died of the Israelites in the Battle of Jericho? None. Went to the next battle. People died. So there was something wrong, and eventually it was found out that there was one person who had disobeyed God, and that affected the whole nation. And God dealt with that person through Joshua. Joshua narrowed it down, and that person paid for his sin, which affected everyone with his life in his family. The Puritans didn't want a repeat of that. They wanted to make sure their colony was dedicated to God. And so if there's someone who is teaching things that goes against what the pastors were saying and what the colony believed, like Ann Hutchinson, or somebody coming in from outside, like the Quakers, who were disrupting things, and were warned not to come back. Eventually, they dealt with them severely. You know, some Quakers, I think, had some of them they put a hole through their tongue. Some were actually hanged because they kept coming back. So it wasn't as if there were no warnings. It wasn't like there was the Gestapo going around and trying to find people. But when people were actively going against what the Puritans considered to be the biblical standards of their colony, they felt in order to protect the colony, they had to act. Any comments? Yes, Michaela?
I thought it was really interesting to learn about the Quakers because, like, my grandparents were Quakers and my dad was, like, raised as a Quaker. And so, like, to actually hear, like, how they started and what they did was really interesting.
Yes, Quakers in the last century are nothing like the Quakers back then. Did you read about the woman who came into a meeting and totally naked to disrupt things?
And my daughter, like,
Quakers don't do that anymore? Okay, good to know.
Like, I thought it was interesting how
Stephen,
What?
what, Michaela?
I thought it was really interesting how, like, they were very, like, upset and they were trying to cause problems and they're trying to get, like, into a fight. Where now, like, they are conscious of churches and will not fight
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. And there was a lot more emphasis at the beginning, following George Fox, of basically, I mean, it was basically a New Age movement. It was, you know, look within yourself to find guidance. The conservative Quakers today still follow that to some extent, but there is another branch of Quakers that are very liberal in their theology. They don't, you know, they don't believe in the Bible and the miracles so much. They're just all about social justice. And then there's a branch of Quakers that's not all Friends. And you go to a Friends church, and that's pretty much like any other evangelical church. All right. So for the Quakers, it was let your conscience be your guide, not the Bible. We'll talk about Quakers later anyway. So okay, that was interesting. Anything else interesting in the chapter besides missing the point? All right. Now we're going to move on to the other colonies of New England. And the next colony is going to be Connecticut. Here's Massachusetts, Boston, Salem, Plymouth, along here, Cape Cod. And then the next colony is going to be Connecticut. The context of expansion into Connecticut is something that was brought up by Thomas Hooker, and that was overpopulation. Thomas Hooker, one of the Puritan leaders, complained, quote, as a fundamental error that towns were set so near to each other, unquote. So he felt that the towns were too close, that when they planned where to put towns, they didn't take into consideration that the towns might grow. Maybe you've seen that in your yards. Have your parents ever plant some trees and not realize how big they would get? You ever seen that? Yeah, sometimes bushes. You plant something and you don't think, okay, 20 years from now, how's this going to look? And that's what they feel to take into consideration, according to Thomas Hooker. So overpopulation was one reason for expanding. Secondly, the inability of the soil to support the population economically. The soil was thin and poor with few areas for pasturage. So especially as you moved away from the harbors along the coast, if you got further inland, the soil got more rocky. You couldn't grow stuff very well, and there wasn't good places to feed your cattle either. So Hooker pointed out that problem. The next was a reaction to the Massachusetts oligarchy and limited franchise. Hooker was among those who disagreed with the leadership, the oligarchy, the few people that were running Massachusetts, concerning who should be allowed to vote. So in Massachusetts, that's what franchise means, who can vote. So Massachusetts limited voting to whom? Surely you've come across this, if we haven't mentioned it.
Church members?
Church members, male church members. Hooker thought should be expanded beyond that. Next, there was hostility of the Massachusetts government to the suggestion of relocation. Hooker and others were saying, look, we need to expand, we need to relocate some of our people because it's too crowded, and these other reasons as well. And the Massachusetts government was against it. They said the departure of Mr. Hooker would not only draw many from us, but also divert friends that would come to us. They were afraid of losing people, not only from their colony, but if any more people came over from England, that they might go to these other places instead of to them. I'm not sure what they thought they were going to do with all those people, because it was already overcrowded, but they were afraid of losing people. All right? Any questions about the context here and the reasons for wanting to move away from the coast? All right, the area to the southwest of Massachusetts, this direction, was opened for settlement by the Dutch, who established a trading post at Hartford, up the Connecticut River. So there was a trading post here, and Plymouth, not real far away, the people living in Plymouth had gone there, knew about that trading post, and they had contact with the Puritans up in here. They told them about this, and they said that would be a good place to live. And so after 1635, Puritans flowed into the Connecticut River Valley. So this is a close-up. Here's Hartford up the Connecticut River. So the Dutch established a trading post there. Puritans heard that it was a good place, and so they began to come and settle in this area. Any questions? All right, the planting of Puritanism in Connecticut, then, how did it come about? First of all, it's through the efforts of Thomas Hooker, who is shown here in this statue. He was chosen pastor of the church at Newton upon his arrival in 1633. That's in Massachusetts. And in June 1636, only after 3 years, he led his parish to Hartford. Notice, he didn't just call for volunteers. Hey, anybody want to go to Hartford? No, his church went to Hartford. Remember we said before that among the Puritans, they came as congregations and they moved as congregations. He led the colony until his death in 1647. Now, one of the most important things that comes about as a result of this move is something that Thomas Hooker wrote, and that was called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. Just 3 years after moving, he wrote essentially a constitution for the colony. Or if you remember that, because this is the first written constitution in America. So the Mayflower was important because it set up the standard of self-government, but the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was an actual constitution for how the colony would be specifically governed. So the first written Constitution in America. And as a part of that, Hooker adopted completely the system used in Massachusetts, with the exception of eliminating church membership requirement for voting. So he opened it up to any male landowners. So you have to be a member of the church in order to vote. So those who own property, possess good character, and were religious could vote. Now, even at that, that's a third of the colony. So there's a number of people who still can't vote for one reason or another. But he opened it up quite a bit. Now, you might think that this would have caused a problem between Hooker and the Massachusetts authorities, because Hooker went against their wishes and moved his congregation to another place. But in fact, the estrangement between Hooker and Massachusetts was not a continued point of contention. John Conn said this concerning Hooker: he seems to have been regarded the common property of the churches in all the New England colonies, unquote. In other words, all the churches of New England looked to Thomas Hooker as a person of value and relied upon him. For example, he was an elected moderator of the first New England Synod, all the churches getting together. He was effectual in healing the schism between Wilson, Wheelwright, and Cotton at the time of Anne Hutchinson. And he was invited by Cotton and Davenport to attend the Westminster Assembly of Divines in England in 1642. What came out of the Westminster Assembly of Divines? Sally? Yeah, Westminster Catechism and the Westminster Confession came out of that. So this was a meeting of the most important people of Puritan thinking in England and New England. And he was invited to attend that. He refused, however, because by this time he had become congregational. He began to see the church as each one being individual and having autonomy themselves without being part of the Church of England. All right, so that's Thomas Hooker. Any questions about Hooker? Okay, you have a way to remember his name? Maybe picture a fishing hook coming down into Connecticut. Because we've got another name we need to know next, also in Connecticut, and his name is John Davenport. John Davenport desired to establish a church and commonwealth based on a model that seemed more scriptural than any other. He was concerned that maybe the Puritan model lacked something. He wanted to make sure that it was scriptural. So he left Massachusetts to establish a settlement in New Haven in 1638. So the first settlement for the English in Connecticut was Hartford. Davenport came down to New Haven and established another colony there. Or a settlement, I should say, maybe. And he did restrict voting to church members. For him, the church and state were intimately knit. So government and the church were tied together. Davenport served there until 1668, when he accepted a call to First Church Boston. Again, you see that even though he left, they didn't hold grudges or hard feelings, so that he was able to come back to Boston and serve as a pastor of one of the major churches there. As you see in the bottom, the colonies of Hartford and New Haven, with its surrounding towns, merged to form the colony of Connecticut in 1662. So it starts out as settlement of Hartford, planted by Hooker, settlement at New Haven, planted by Davenport, and then in 1662, They joined together and formed Connecticut. Any questions about Connecticut? That's all there is to say about Connecticut. Anybody ever been to Connecticut? Okay. It's relatively small as states go today. All right, next let's look at Rhode Island. And this concerns a guy by the name of Roger Williams. Roger Williams arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, bringing with him a reputation for being a strong and opinionated leader, and soon demonstrated that he was also the purveyor of strange ideas. These ideas soon led to dissension. The main points of his contention was this. He said that it was a national sin for England to take Indian land without just compensation. So he's reflecting this back on England. He said it's a national sin that England is taking land, stealing land from the Indians, basically. Any question there? The second contention was that he denounced the Puritans for not severing all ties with the Church of England. You know, you came here to escape what's going on in England. Why are you still connected with the Church of England? Cut the ties. Be independent. All right, so those are the two things that he was talking about. And maybe the most important of all of the contentions was he believed in the complete separation of church and state. You see how that would be fundamentally abhorrent to the Puritan leadership. Because again, they've got this vision of a city on a hill. It's a government. It's a state. It's an organization that is a combination of the government and the church together. The state and church working together to produce a godly society. Williams is saying, no, we need to separate the government from the church. And the Puritans said, well, how can we have a godly society if we separate them? But that's what Williams advocated. All right, so without getting into all the details, eventually Williams was banished from the colony. Again, they went to him over and over again, said, please stop talking about this stuff, please stop causing dissension. We like you, you're a good preacher and everything, but you've got to stop bringing up this stuff that is disagreeable. And he refused to do it. As it says in your notes, I believe the last concept was especially offensive to the Puritan leadership, and a short explanation. So as a result, the General Court banished Williams in 1635. And eventually they came down to where they had warned and warned and warned, and they finally said, you just can't stay anymore. And have it be wintertime. And so the picture a lot of times that we get is, oh, those nasty Puritans, they kicked Roger Williams out in the wintertime. Well, they had tried and tried and tried to get him to stop doing what he was doing. And they finally said, you're going to have to leave. And so he left. And he was taken in by the Narragansett Indians. And he led some of his followers then to establish a settlement they called Providence in the region known as Rhode Island. So you can see not very far away, Providence is right here. This becomes Rhode Island. By the way, Williams had once been a missionary to the Indians, and that may be why they felt kindly toward him and took him in. But one of the strange ideas that he did have, and he stopped being a missionary to the Indians because he felt that Christ was coming soon, and that Christ himself would come and speak to the Indians in their own language, so why should he bother? The colony of Rhode Island instituted complete separation of church and state, prohibiting the government from establishing or supporting one religious group and protecting the churches from state interference. Now, when he said church separation of church and state, he did not mean what people today mean when they say separation of church and state. He simply meant that there was a difference between them, that the state operates, but he did not believe that the church should not have influence on the state, on government, which is what people mean today. They don't want any kind of religious views at all to have any influence. That's not what he meant by it at all. He just meant they operate as two separate entities. Although Williams continued to embrace strange ideas of theology, and his ideas and his openness for other religious groups attracted a variety of religious groups and malcontents. If you got kicked out of anywhere, you could go to Rhode Island. If you had trouble getting along with people because of religious issues, you could go to Rhode Island. You're welcome there. But he began to narrow his views of what a pure church was more and more. He began eliminating people in his church as saying, well, you're not pure enough, you're not pure enough. And eventually got down to his wife, and he wasn't sure about her either. So he got a little strange in some ways. But he was still valued by the Puritans in Massachusetts as a scholar and a friend. In fact, they used for many years a pamphlet he had written about Quakerism. And they used that. All right, so that's Roger Williams and the establishment of Providence, which would then become part of Rhode Island. Any question about Roger Williams? Oh, I didn't mention, he's also, because of his strange views, he's also considered to be the one who establishes the first Baptist church in America. So if you're Baptist, you may hear that. Roger Williams, the first Baptist in America. The way he kept changing his mind, he was probably Baptist for about 30 seconds. Now, it was longer than that. It was months, I'm sure. But he was baptized, or he had one of the guys baptize him, immerse him, and he baptized the other guy. And they started meeting together, so that's considered the First Baptist Church. But he didn't remain that all his life. All right, next is Anne Hutchinson, whom we read about. So we'll quickly go over her experience. She followed her Puritan pastor, John Conn, to Massachusetts in 1634. At the age of 45, she had 15 children. Her strong personality and eloquence attracted many to her home on Mondays to discuss the previous Sunday's sermon by Mr. Cotton. She greatly extolled the teachings of Cotton and denigrated the sermons of other Puritan pastors, claiming that they were not emphasizing sufficiently grace and were too much concerned with law-keeping. Being unwilling at first to rein in such a devoted disciple, because, what pastor wants to shut down somebody who thinks they're the greatest pastor ever? You can see why that would be a problem, right? And so he was kind of reluctant, but eventually the other Puritan pastors prevailed upon him, and he had to counsel her to cease in her teachings, and especially certain teachings that she was promulgating, which with Cotton disagreed as well. And they, let's see, what was that? Oh, here they are. Outward obedience. Okay, what she was teaching is called antinomianism. Anti means what? Everybody? Anti is what? Not or against. Nomian means law, from the Greek word nomos. Antinomian is anti-law. What does she mean by that? Or what do people mean by that? If you're antinomian, you think that the law is not important for Christians. Christians don't need to keep the law. I just saw on the internet that a very famous mega church pastor in the United States recently has said that Christians don't need to keep the Ten Commandments. Now, I don't know what context he said that. I need to find out. But if he meant that we're under no obligation at all to keep God's law, then I think he's missing something there. And that's what she was concerned about. She was concerned about the fact that Puritans emphasized that as Christians we need to still keep God's law. She said, no, we don't need to do that. Among the other things that caused a problem is, she said, here's the definition of antinomianism. Outward obedience to the Scriptures was unnecessary to demonstrate an inward relationship. The Puritans said, how do you know that you're a Christian? Because your life shows it. You are obedient to God. She says that doesn't mean a thing. You can have the inward relationship with God and not obey Him. All right, so that's the antinomianism. Also, she believed that God had given her direct revelation that superseded the Bible. So she claimed to get revelation from God, and she said that is above what the Bible says. That's even more problematic. So Hutchinson was banished as well. Again, as you should have read in the chapter, they attempted to get her to stop proclaiming these things, and she would not. She was completely unresponsive to counseling. And so the court voted to banish her, which took place months later in March 1638. She and a few supporters traveled to Rhode Island, where they established a small settlement called Portsmouth. And we'll finish up with her tomorrow and go on to New Hampshire. No assignment for tomorrow except to look over your notes to review them for the coming quiz.